There is a 400-page Soviet government report on the Yeti that almost nobody in the West has ever read in full. It was compiled in the late 1950s by a commission of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, and it represents the largest single body of evidence on the existence of a Yeti-type creature ever assembled by a national government anywhere on the planet. The historian who led the commission spent the last 15 years of his life trying to publish what he found. He died of a heart attack on the day his next book was banned. The report itself was never properly released. The follow-up book was suppressed, with the Academy authorizing only 180 preliminary copies, all of which then went missing for over half a century. The man's research was officially declared a pseudoscience. His name was buried so completely that when his manuscripts finally resurfaced in recent years, his descendants had to help researchers locate and translate them into English for the first time. Most people who hear the word Yeti picture Nepal, the Himalayas, Sherpa guides and Buddhist monasteries, and ice axes at 20,000 feet. The Soviets, working from a dataset that included over 1,000 independent eyewitness reports, came to a different conclusion. They thought the Yeti's most likely home was not in Nepal at all. They thought it was in their own territory. I am Alex, and over the next 40 minutes or so, we are going to walk through the strangest and least covered chapter in cryptid research history. The names, the expeditions, the suppressed findings, the men who paid for it with his career and quite possibly his life. And we are going to talk about why, decades after the Soviet Union itself collapsed, most of what those expeditions found is still sitting in places nobody has been allowed to look.
Before we get into all of this, I want to be straight with you. I came into this story expecting a footnote, a goofy Soviet expedition. What I actually found is the most ambitious cryptid research program any government has ever run. And the way it ended is genuinely disturbing. So stick with me, because this gets weirder than I expected.
To understand any of this, you have to understand Boris Porshnev. He is the central figure, and he is also the reason the story has the shape it has. If you do not grasp who he was before he ever heard the word Yeti, none of what came after makes sense. Porshnev was born in 1905 and died in 1972. He was a Soviet historian and philosopher with a long and respected academic career. His primary specialty was European history, specifically popular revolts in pre-revolutionary France, the kind of dense, archive-heavy work that gets cited in academic journals for decades. The French historian Michel Foucault referenced his work in lectures at the Collège de France in the early 1970s. He was not in any sense a fringe figure. He was also the kind of academic who took unusual ideas seriously and worked them rigorously. One of his earlier theories proposed that language itself was the driving force of human evolution, that the ability to communicate more than tool use or upright posture was what split our ancestors from earlier hominids. That is an unconventional hypothesis even by modern standards. He developed it carefully and published it through proper academic channels. So when reports of the Yeti started filtering out of the Himalayas in the mid-1950s, Porshnev did not react the way you might expect a serious philosopher to react. He did not dismiss it as folklore. He asked himself a question. If a relict population of early hominids had survived somewhere on the planet, if our extinct cousins were still walking around in remote areas, where would they most likely be, and what would the testimonial evidence look like? This is the crucial framing distinction, and I want to land it because everything downstream depends on it. Western researchers in the 1950s and 60s tended to frame the Yeti as a possible undiscovered great ape, something in the same family as gorillas or orangutans, just adapted to high altitude. Porshnev rejected that framing. He thought the descriptions did not fit an ape. They fit a hominid, Specifically, he thought the Yeti might be a surviving population of Neanderthals. That is a much harder claim to make. It is also, in some ways, a much more interesting one. Neanderthals are not great apes. They are us, more or less. Anatomically, modern humans share between 1% and 4% of our DNA with them, depending on ancestry. They had brains roughly the same size as ours. They used tools, made fire, buried their dead, possibly painted in caves. The mainstream view is that they went extinct around 40,000 years ago. Porshnev was suggesting that maybe they did not. I personally find Porshnev's framing more compelling than the great ape hypothesis, and here is why. The accounts we get from people who have encountered Yeti-type creatures, whether in the Himalayas or the Caucasus or the Pacific Northwest, almost never sound like an ape. They sound like a person, bipedal, intelligent, evasive, capable of choices, sometimes apparently capable of speech or imitation. That is not gorilla behavior, that is not orangutan behavior. Those are people behaviors performed by a person who is not us. So that is where Porshnev started. A respected Soviet academic in the post-Stalinist political thaw of the late 1950s decided the Yeti question deserves serious scientific investigation, and that the most likely answer was not a missing primate but an extinct relative of human beings still surviving in the world's most remote corners. He took that hypothesis to the Soviet Academy of Sciences and asked for institutional backing. Remarkably, he got it. We will get to what they did with it in a moment. But first, we have to talk about what happened when he asked the public for help. In early 1958, with the Academy's backing, Porshnev did something Western researchers never thought to do. He published an article in Pravda. Pravda was the official newspaper of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It was the most widely read publication in the entire country, distributed across every republic from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. When something appeared in Pravda, it was read by millions of people the next morning over breakfast. What Porshnev wrote was an open call. He explained his hypothesis. He laid out what was known about the Himalayan Yeti, and he asked anyone who might have had a similar encounter or who knew local traditions about hairy bipedal creatures in the mountains to write to him at the Academy of Sciences. He gave them an address. The response was overwhelming. Over 1,000 letters arrived. They came from across the Soviet Union, which at the time covered roughly 1/6 of the planet's land surface. They came from the Caucasus Mountains in the south, from the Pamirs in Tajikistan, from the Tian Shan Range in Kyrgyzstan, from Mongolia, from Siberia, from remote villages in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan that most people in Moscow had never heard of. Here's the part that matters. The letters were consistent. Different languages, different cultures, different mountain ranges separated by thousands of miles. The letter writers had no contact with each other. They could not have been comparing notes. And yet the creature they described was the same creature, with regional variations that fit the kind of local adaptation you would expect across that much geography. The names were different in every region. In the Caucasus, they called it the Almasty. In Mongolia, the Almas. In parts of the Pamirs, Dev or Gul. In Kyrgyzstan, Ksikyik. In Siberia, the Menk. There were a dozen other regional names from a dozen other valleys, but the descriptions all converged: bipedal, hair-covered, larger than a human in some accounts, though some regions described smaller variants, intelligent, evasive, more human-like than ape-like in posture and behavior. Some of the specific reports are worth pulling out. There were accounts from the Faizabad district of Tajikistan describing strange hominids living in caves and creeks. From Urgut in Uzbekistan, locals reported creatures that would sit for hours on earthen mounds, leaving behind deep imprints. From parts of Kyrgyzstan, descriptions of bipedal beings with feet roughly twice the size of human feet, oddly paddle-shaped. reports of cries, howls, and territorial behavior. Even reports of attacks on livestock and, in a few cases, on people. If you have watched my coverage of Sasquatch sighting patterns across North America before, this should sound very familiar. The BFRO database has a similar shape. Independent witnesses across thousands of miles, with no incentive to coordinate, describing the same creature with regional variation. When that pattern shows up across non-communicating populations, that is not a folklore meme spreading on social media. That is a signal in a very large data set, and it is worth taking seriously even if you are not yet sure what it means. In the Native Elder video I did a while back, we covered how indigenous traditions across multiple unrelated North American nations have described Sasquatch in remarkably consistent terms for centuries. Before the word Bigfoot was even coined, the Soviet letters in 1958 were doing something similar in real time across an even larger area. Porshnev had stumbled onto the largest single eyewitness dataset of cryptid encounters ever assembled, and he had the institutional backing to do something with it. The Soviet Academy of Sciences formally established what came to be called the Snowman Commission in early 1958. It was created on Porshnev's initiative. It operated out of Moscow with full government funding. It existed officially for 3 years. And I want to take a moment here because the commission itself is genuinely unprecedented in modern scientific history. No major Western government has ever formally backed an organized program to investigate a cryptid. Britain did not do it. The United States did not do it. France, Germany, Japan, none of them did it. The closest comparable effort was a separate Chinese investigation into the Yeren, the Chinese version of the Yeti, conducted by their Academy of Sciences. The fact that 2 of the largest governments on the planet thought the question deserved formal scientific resources in the same decade should make you pause before you write the whole field off. The Commission's first major project was a field expedition, the most concentrated cluster of eyewitness reports after Porshnev's team analyzed the letters came from the Pamir Mountains of Tajikistan, specifically the upper river valleys around the Sarezki Basin and the Muksu River. These are some of the highest and most remote ranges in Central Asia, and they had been generating wild man stories for centuries. In the summer of 1958, the Commission launched a major expedition to the Pamirs. The stated objective was to follow up the most credible reports, document footprints and other physical traces, and if at all possible, confirm the existence of the creature. The expedition failed, no physical evidence was recovered, no clear sightings were made by expedition members. The team returned, the report was filed, and the official conclusion was that the Yeti hypothesis was unsupported. That is the version that ended up in the Soviet press. But here is what later researchers, including Marie-Jeanne Kaufman and Dmitry Bayanov, would argue about that expedition for the rest of their lives. The expedition was not simply a failure, it was sabotaged from the inside. The leadership of the expedition, according to Bayanov's account, was placed under figures who were openly hostile to the Yeti hypothesis from the start. The botanist Kirill Stanyukovich, whose primary research interest was the high-altitude plant life of Central Asia, was a major figure in the operation.
I want to be very careful here, because this is where the story crosses from weird scientific history into something that sounds like a conspiracy theory. So let me say it plainly. I am not asking you to believe the 1958 expedition was sabotaged. I am asking you to notice that the people who knew the data best spent the rest of their lives arguing it was. That is worth weighing.
Stanyukovich had published doubts about the Yeti question publicly before the expedition was even fielded. Putting him in a leadership role meant the expedition would be conducted in a way structurally unlikely to find anything. According to Bayanov, the expedition's data collection was deliberately steered away from the regions where the most credible reports originated. The interviews with locals were conducted in ways designed to discourage rather than encourage detailed testimony. And the official report omitted findings that did not fit the predetermined conclusion. Marie-Jeanne Kaufmann, who became the leading Soviet field researcher in the decades that followed, reportedly compiled the full alternate account of the expedition. As far as I can tell, that material has never been fully translated or released to a Western audience. The official 1958 expedition report was used by the Commission's opponents to argue that the entire Yeti question was settled, and that the Snowman Commission should be wound down. Hominology, the term Bayanov would later coin for the field, was on its way to being declared a pseudoscience. Quick thing before we keep going, if you have been finding this useful, hit the like button and consider subscribing. We do a lot of these long, deep dives, and I personally think the Soviet chapter of cryptid research is one of the most underappreciated stories in the field. There's a video I did on how indigenous testimony gets dismissed by Western institutional science. Same playbook, different decade, and I will link it in the description if you want the broader context. Even with the Pamir expedition compromised, the Snowman Commission still had its underlying dataset. The 1,000+ letters, the historical accounts, the local traditions cataloged across the Soviet Union's mountain regions. The Commission spent its 3 operational years compiling all of this into a single document. The result was a report of roughly 400 pages. It was internal to the Academy of Sciences. It was not widely distributed. And it contained a finding that, to my knowledge, has never been seriously discussed in Western Yeti coverage. The Commission concluded that the most likely habitat of the creature it was investigating was not the Himalayas at all. It was the band of mountain ranges that runs through Soviet Central Asia and into Mongolia, specifically the region between the Tian Shan, the Pamir, and the Mongolian highlands. I want you to sit with that for a second. Soviet scientists working from the largest single eyewitness dataset of Yeti-type encounters ever compiled concluded that the Yeti was primarily a Soviet phenomenon. The Western framing of the Yeti as a Nepali or Tibetan creature was, in their view, a geographic accident. The Himalayas got famous because that is where Western mountaineers were operating in the 1950s. The actual concentration of reports was further north. This makes sense if you understand the geography. The Pamir Alai, the Hisar Range, the Tian Shan, these are some of the most remote, least populated, highest altitude mountain regions on the planet. Vast valleys, glaciers, alpine forests, areas that even today see only handfuls of human visitors per year. If a relict hominid population had survived anywhere into the modern era, this is exactly the kind of habitat that would shelter it. Better than Nepal in many ways, because the Himalayan trekking economy has put humans in the high passes constantly for over a century, while these Soviet ranges remained largely empty. The Commission's finding never reached the West in a meaningful way. By the time the report was completed, the political climate around Soviet hominology was already turning hostile. The findings were buried inside the 400-page internal document. Porshnev would try to publish a version of it in 1963, but as we will see, that effort got crushed before the book could reach any kind of audience. I personally think this is the single most important Soviet finding, and it is the single most ignored one. If they were right, and they had better data on the question than anyone before or since, then every Western Yeti expedition for the past 70 years has been searching in the wrong country. Nepal got the brand, the Soviets had the territory. There's another piece of this worth flagging. The Commission's regional reports mapped out something that mirrors what has been popular lately in Yeti coverage: a multi-type taxonomy. The Soviets were not documenting one creature. They were documenting several, with different sizes and behaviors associated with different mountain ranges. The Almasty of the Caucasus was described as smaller and more man-like. The reports from the Pamirs described larger, more ape-like creatures. Mongolian reports clustered around a mid-sized variant. This matches almost perfectly the 3 types taxonomy that has been circulating in popular Yeti content recently. The Soviets were finding the same pattern in their own territory 60 years ago. By 1961, the Snowman Commission was over. Officially, it had completed its work. Unofficially, it had been shut down by political opponents inside the Academy of Sciences, who had no interest in seeing the Yeti question taken seriously. Within a few more years, the broader field, Porshnev's emerging discipline of hominology, had been formally declared a pseudoscience. Soviet science journalism stopped covering it. Mainstream Soviet publication channels were closed off to Porshnev and his small group of researchers. Academic conferences would not invite them. Universities would not employ them in the relevant capacity. The infrastructure of legitimate science had been turned against them. In 1963, Porshnev finished what was supposed to be his definitive work on the subject. The manuscript ran to 416 pages and represented his lifetime synthesis of the Snowman Commission's data, the historical record, and his theoretical case for the relict hominid hypothesis. He submitted it for publication. The Academy responded by authorizing the production of 180 preliminary copies, not for sale to the public. For limited circulation among academic colleagues, that was it. The book was, for all practical purposes, suppressed. Then, over the following years, the 180 copies disappeared. Not all at once and not through any single dramatic event. They simply were not reprinted, not archived in any accessible way, not translated, not reviewed in any mainstream venue. By the 1970s, locating a copy was nearly impossible. The book and its contents drifted into something like deliberate obscurity, where they would remain for over half a century. The manuscript only reached a Western audience in recent years, when Porshnev's family helped researchers track down a surviving copy and translate it into English. Porshnev himself had been working on a follow-up book at the time of his death in 1972. According to the hominologists who knew him, he had been told that the new book would not be allowed to publish either. He had a heart attack soon after. I want to handle this carefully because I do not want to overclaim. A heart attack is a heart attack. Porshnev was 67 years old, which was within the normal range for cardiovascular events at the time. He had spent the last 15 years of his life under enormous professional and political stress, fighting an uphill battle against an entire scientific establishment that had decided to bury his life's work. People die under that kind of pressure. They do not have to be murdered for the cause of death story to be tragic. But it is grim. The man who organized the largest cryptid research program in history, who compiled over 1,000 independent eyewitness reports into a structured analysis, who had published an unconventional hypothesis through proper channels at proper institutions, that man died on the day his life's central thesis was effectively erased from the scientific record. Even if you are a hard skeptic on the Yeti question itself, the suppression of legitimate scientific inquiry should bother you. The Soviets investigated, they documented, they were on the verge of concluding. Then someone made very sure the conclusions never got out. This is also where I want to land the title's claim. When I say most of what they found is still classified, I want to be precise about what I mean. It is not classified in the redacted CIA document sense. It is not stamped top secret in some military archive. It is something subtler and in some ways worse. It has been functionally hidden from the world for over 50 years through institutional bans, withheld printings, academic blacklisting, and the deliberate erasure of the people who did the work. Whether the original 400-page commission report still exists somewhere in the bowels of the Russian Academy of Sciences is a question I genuinely cannot answer, but has not been published. It has not been translated. It has not been made available to anyone who would scrutinize it. And the people who could have made it available are dead. When Porshnev died in 1972, the official Soviet research program on relic hominids had already been over for a decade. But the work did not end with him, it just went underground. Dmitry Bayanov is the bridge figure between the Snowman Commission era and the modern hominology community. Bayanov was born in 1932, trained in humanities, and met Porshnev in 1964. He had read one of the surviving copies of Porshnev's suppressed manuscript, and after the meeting, he committed himself to the field for the rest of his life. He died in 2020, having spent over 50 years on the question. It was Bayanov who coined the term hominology in the early 1970s. He took the name partly to legitimize the field, to give it the linguistic seriousness of biology or geology, and partly to distinguish what he was doing from cryptozoology more broadly. Hominology, in Bayanov's framing, was specifically the study of relict hominids, human relatives that did not go extinct. Not the same as Bigfoot research in the loose sense, not the same as Loch Ness Monster research. A specific, disciplined, anatomically focused investigation. He set up shop at the Darwin Museum in Moscow, where the Relict Hominoid Research Seminar has been running continuously since 1964. Bayanov became its chairman in 1975. They have published sporadically a series of thin brochures called Vestnik Gominology, the Bulletin of Hominology, distributed by hand among researchers who could read Russian and were willing to work outside mainstream channels. Marie-Jeanne Kaufmann ran a parallel research line in the Caucasus. She organized expeditions through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, gathering eyewitness reports from villages across the mountain region. Kaufmann reportedly observed Almasty multiple times in daylight at relatively close distance, claims I want to flag as remarkable. Most cryptid sightings happen at night, at distance, under conditions where confirmation bias has room to operate. Daylight close distance multiple observation is a higher quality category of testimony, and Kaufmann gave it credibility through decades of field experience. Igor Burtsev is the third major figure of this generation and the only one of the three who is still alive at the time of writing. He is the director of what is now called the International Center of Hominology, and he has continued to organize expeditions and maintain archives into the present day. What is striking about all three of them is the conditions they worked under, self-funded for most of their careers, ostracized from Soviet mainstream science for over 50 years, operating in the shadow of Porshnev's suppression, watching their field declared a pseudoscience while they continued to do the work. That is commitment. That is also, frankly, what scientific dissent looks like under a hostile establishment.
If any of you read Russian or have come across the Bulletin of Hominology or any of Kaufmann's archival materials, drop me a comment. There is a lot of material in those archives that have never been translated, and I would genuinely love to talk to someone who can read it.
The most documented Soviet expedition of the post-commission era is something called Hisar 80, which ran in 1980 and 1981 in the Pamir Alai range of Tajikistan. The expedition was led by a mountaineer named Igor Tatzel, and it represents one of the few Soviet field operations of the era to receive any kind of Western press coverage. We know about Hisar 80 partly because of a UPI archive piece from November 1981, where Tatzel spoke at length about what his expedition had observed. The article is still findable today if you know where to look, It is not lost lore. It is a piece of mainstream Western journalism from the era, and it documents claims that, taken seriously, are remarkable. The expedition operated in remote valleys of the Gisar Mountains, an offshoot of the Pamir Alai system. Tassel told UPI that multiple expedition members had reported sightings of a Yeti-type creature, mostly at night, mostly at distance. The most documented sighting was made by an expedition member named Nina Greneva in August 1980. During a night vigil, Greneva reportedly observed a 6-foot-tall creature at relatively close range. The expedition was carrying cameras. They got nothing. That is the part that, if you have watched cryptid content for any length of time, should sound familiar. Tatzel was direct about it in his UPI interview. He said that when expedition members carried cameras, flashes, or other equipment, they always proved useless. His framing was specific. He suggested that the creature's senses might be more developed than ours and that they might be sensing the expedition's intentions in some way that humans do not fully understand. He talked about wanting spontaneous, friendly contact rather than capture. Here is why I'm flagging this. The camera failure detail is one of the most consistent claims across cryptid research traditions worldwide. It comes up in Sasquatch reports across North America. It comes up in Yeti reports from the Himalayas. It comes up in Almasty reports from the Caucasus. It comes up in Alma reports from Mongolia. It is reported by witnesses who have no contact with each other, in cultures with no shared folklore tradition. Either it is a universal coincidence in cryptid encounter narratives, a kind of folkloric meme that emerges spontaneously across human populations to explain why these creatures are never photographed, or it is a real pattern. I personally do not know which is true. I find it genuinely interesting that the same detail keeps surfacing in independent traditions, and I find the standard skeptical explanations, fear and adrenaline degrading photo quality, broken equipment in extreme conditions, confirmation bias, partially convincing but not fully. I covered some of this territory in the video I did on why we do not have clear Yeti or Bigfoot footage despite the proliferation of trail cameras and smartphones. The infrasound theory, the camera shyness behavior, the possibility that these creatures have evolved to avoid exactly the kind of detection technology that is becoming ubiquitous. The Soviet researchers were reporting the same patterns decades before any of those theories were popular. Tatzel's other claim from the UPI interview is worth pulling out. He said the expedition members concluded that the creatures might be intellectually closer to humans than to apes. They might be capable of reasoning, of intent, of choosing whether to be seen. This is consistent with the Porshnev framing, with Bayanov's hominology, with the Kaufman observations from the Caucasus. It is also consistent with what indigenous traditions across multiple continents have always said about the creature. Hisar 80 is one expedition. It produced no physical evidence. It did not break the field open, but it gives us a documented snapshot of what Soviet hominology actually looked like in field operation by 1980. 22 years after the Snowman Commission was founded, and after 20 years of being told the work was a pseudoscience. I want to spend a few minutes on a case most of you have probably heard of, because the timing is something almost no one connects. In February 1959, 9 experienced Soviet hikers, students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, all of them seasoned alpine trekkers, died under inexplicable circumstances on the eastern slope of a mountain called Kholatsyakhl in the northern Ural Mountains. The case became known as the Dyatlov Pass incident, named after the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. The hikers had cut their way out of their tent from the inside in the middle of the night and fled barefoot or partially dressed into sub-zero conditions. They were found weeks and months later, scattered across nearly a mile of terrain with injuries that included fractured skulls, crushed ribs, missing eyes, and in one case, a missing tongue. The official Soviet investigation, conducted under classified conditions for years, concluded that the hikers had died from a compelling natural force the nature of which could not be determined. The Yeti theory has been one of the named candidate explanations for what happened, particularly because the severity of the injuries seemed to require force beyond what the avalanche hypothesis could readily explain. Some theorists have specifically attributed the deaths to a mink, the local Mansi indigenous tradition's name for the regional Yeti-type creature. The northern Urals had active Mansi traditions about exactly this kind of being. I want to be honest with you about where I land on this because I do not think you should take Dyatlov as proof of anything. The Yeti theory is the weakest of the major Dyatlov contenders factually. A 2021 paper published in a Nature Partner journal proposed a specific slab avalanche model that accounts for the injuries pretty well. And that is probably the strongest current explanation. I find the avalanche case more persuasive than the Yeti case. I do not think a creature attacked those hikers. But the timing is what is worth pointing out, and almost nobody does. Dyatlov happened in February 1959. The Snowman Commission was operating at full capacity in February 1959. Porshnev's Pravda article had triggered 1,000 letters less than a year earlier. The Academy of Sciences was actively investigating the existence of a relict hominid in Soviet mountain territory in the same months that 9 experienced hikers died on a slope, in a region with active local traditions about exactly that kind of being. I'm not saying the Snowman Commission knew anything about Dyatlov or that there is a connection. I am saying that the cultural and scientific moment in which the Dyatlov investigation took place was one in which the Soviet government was already officially interested in whether something like that creature existed, and that this context has been almost entirely absent from English-language Dyatlov coverage. The two stories are usually told as if they happened in different worlds. They did not. They happened in the same year, in the same country, with the same scientific establishment in the background. Drop a comment if you have ever heard the Dyatlov Yeti theory, or if you have a different take on what happened on Kholat Shakhl. I read all the comments and I genuinely want to know what you think. Let me pull back for a minute and reframe what we have been covering, because I think the bigger picture matters more than any individual case. For most of the 20th century, Western cryptid research operated on a kind of geographic assumption. Yeti were Himalayan, Sasquatch were Pacific Northwest. They were treated as separate phenomena, occasionally compared but rarely connected. Soviet hominology, almost alone among research traditions, took a different view. From Porshnev forward, the Soviet position was that these were probably the same phenomenon, distributed across the temperate and subarctic mountain ranges of the northern hemisphere, with regional variations. The Almasty is the Soviet center of gravity for this view. It is the name used most consistently in the Caucasus Mountains, and it is the creature that Marie-Jeanne Kaufmann spent decades documenting through eyewitness interviews. Almasty are described as smaller than the Himalayan Yeti, closer to human size, sometimes shorter than human size, and considerably more man-like in posture and behavior. The Caucasus reports describe creatures that interact with human settlements at the edges, occasionally raid livestock, sometimes flee, sometimes confront. I want to mention a case here that is often cited while flagging its limitations honestly. The Zana case is a 19th century account from the Abkhazia region of the Caucasus. Zana was a captured wild woman who lived among human caretakers for decades, supposedly bore several children to local men, and was described as physically distinct from typical humans, taller, much hairier, with unusually robust features. Porshnev investigated the case and claimed to have located some of her descendants. Modern DNA testing on Zana's remaining descendants has been done. The results, as I understand them, suggest that Zana was likely a sub-Saharan African woman, possibly an escaped slave from the Ottoman Empire rather than a relict hominid. So I do not think Zana proves anything about the Almasty. I include the case because it is part of the historical record of Soviet hominology. But I would be misleading you if I treated it as evidence for the relict hominid hypothesis. The cleaner part of the Caucasus testimony is the cumulative weight of Kaufman's interviews. Hundreds of village-level accounts gathered over decades with consistent core details. Multiple witness daylight observations by trained researchers, footprint casts, reported encounters with specific named individuals across generations. None of this is proof in the lab result sense. All of it is data. Pull the camera back further. Almasty in the Caucasus, Yeti in the Himalayas, Sasquatch in the Pacific Northwest, Yeren in central China, Yowie in the Australian backcountry, Orang Pendek in Sumatra. The descriptions vary regionally, the names vary completely, the cultural framings differ enormously, but the core report is recognizable across all of them. Bipedal, hair-covered, larger than human or near human size, intelligent, evasive, associated with remote terrain. I personally find this the hardest part of the field to dismiss. Either every isolated mountain culture from the Pacific Northwest to the Caucasus to the Himalayas to the Australian outback independently invented the same hairy bipedal man creature, which would itself be a remarkable coincidence requiring explanation. Or these reports are describing something that exists, with regional populations adapted to different ecosystems. Neither answer is comfortable. But the parsimony of the second answer, the simplicity of it, is something the Soviet researchers grasped earlier than anyone in the West. That is why their framework still feels relevant decades after their official program was buried. I always try to give the skeptic case its due on this channel, and I want to do that honestly here, because there are real arguments against everything I have laid out. The Western mainstream view is that hominology was correctly classified as a pseudoscience, alongside astrology and parapsychology. The reasoning runs like this. The Pamir expedition produced no physical evidence. The Snowman Commission, despite 3 years of work and government funding, did not recover bones, hair samples that survived modern testing, photographs of the creature, footprint casts that withstood scrutiny, or any of the other evidence categories that would satisfy a skeptical biologist. What they had at the end was testimony. And testimony, even at scale, is not proof. The misidentification arguments are real, and I have to acknowledge them. Himalayan brown bears do exist in the relevant Soviet ranges. Snow leopards exist, wolves exist. Isolated human hermits and bandits exist in remote valleys, as they have for centuries. Many of the eyewitness reports could plausibly be misidentifications of these known animals or people, especially when seen at distance, at night, or under fearful conditions. The fact that thousands of independent witnesses describe similar things does not necessarily mean those things are accurate. It might just mean human pattern matching produces similar errors under similar conditions. Porshnev was a historian, not a primatologist, and he was working outside his professional specialty. That is a real critique. Hominology, as he framed it, required expertise in physical anthropology, primate behavior, anatomy, and field zoology that he did not fully possess. His enthusiasm for the relict Neanderthal hypothesis may have led him to interpret testimony more generously than the data justified. There is also a political scientific critique I want to air fairly. Some historians have argued that Porshnev's interest in Soviet Neanderthals had a political dimension. that finding relict hominids in Soviet territory would have been a way to push back against Western-dominated paleoanthropology, to claim a piece of the human origin story for Russian science. If that motivation existed, it could have biased his interpretation of evidence in subtle ways, even if he was not conscious of it. The 1958 expedition's subversion narrative is largely sourced from Bayanov's later writings. Bayanov was Porshnev's protege and had a personal stake in defending his mentor's legacy. The sabotage claim might be partially Bayanov's retrospective interpretation rather than documented fact. We do not have an independent account of what Stanyukovich and the other expedition leaders actually intended. I take all of these seriously. The honest position is that most of the Soviet evidence is testimonial rather than physical, and testimonial evidence has known limitations. But here's the counter I keep coming back to. Testimonial evidence at the scale Porshnev assembled, over 1,000 independent reports across thousands of square miles, from cultures speaking different languages with no shared folklore, is itself a category of evidence. It is not the kind that closes the case in a lab, but it is the kind that, when it shows up, deserves to be taken seriously and properly investigated. The Soviet failure was that the proper investigation got shut down.
So an honest moment. After spending all this time in the Soviet material, the thing that bothers me the most is not whether Yeti exists or not. It is that we may never know what those researchers actually found, because someone made sure that the records would never be reached. That is the part I keep coming back to.
Here is where I land at the end of all this. What we can say with confidence is that the Soviets ran the most ambitious, cryptid research program any government has ever funded. They had institutional backing from the Academy of Sciences. They had government resources. They had territorial coverage of some of the most likely habitat on the planet. They generated 1,000+ eyewitness report dataset that no Western program has ever matched. They deployed serious researchers, historians, anatomists, mountaineers, anthropologists across multiple decades. What we cannot say is whether they ever found definitive proof. The full commission report has not been published. The Kaufman archives have not been translated. Porshnev's banned second book is, as far as I can tell, lost. Bayanov is dead. The work continues, but the original generation that compiled the underlying evidence is gone, and they took most of what they knew with them. What we know for sure is that their findings were systematically suppressed. The commission was disbanded after 3 years. The book was banned. The field was declared a pseudoscience. The lead researcher died on the day his publication was killed. That is not a normal scientific outcome. That is the outcome you get when an institution decides it does not want a question answered. So the unanswered questions are these. What is actually in the unpublished portions of the 400-page commission report? What was in Kaufman's full Caucasus archives, the ones that have never been translated? What was in Porshnev's second book, the one whose suppression coincided with his death? Maybe the reason we still do not have a clean Yeti DNA sample after 70 years of looking is not that the creature does not exist. Maybe it is that every government that has seriously investigated has decided not to find one.
Thanks for sticking with me until here. I'm Alex, and I personally think Soviet hominology is the most underrated chapter in cryptid history. The fact that an entire branch of science was created around this question, then officially declared a pseudoscience the moment it started producing inconvenient findings, does not smell right to me. And I would love to know what you think.
If any of you have access to Russian language hominology archives or know researchers who do, drop a comment. There are stories in those documents that the rest of the world has not read yet, and someone is going to have to be the one to dig them out. Like the video if you got something out of it. Subscribe if you want more like this. I have a bunch more in the same lane coming up, and I will see you in the next one.